The hogs were shrieking in the pre-dawn darkness of Tennessee, their frenzied squeals tearing through the humid August air like iron scraping against bone. This is the story of how 15 years of brutality culminated in one night of calculated butchery, where a master became nothing more than scattered remains in the mud of his own livestock pen. August 7, 1852. Blackwood County, Tennessee. What began as another sweltering summer morning on a cotton plantation ended with a discovery that would send shockwaves through the entire South and birth legends whispered in slave quarters for generations to come. A gold signet ring glinting in the muck, bone fragments picked clean by animals that knew no difference between their usual feed and human flesh, and one man missing from morning roll call vanished like smoke into the Tennessee hills. This is the story of how one enslaved man's breaking point became his master's final resting place, served in pieces to creatures that cared nothing for the color of meat they consumed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden gate to the hog pen hung crooked on its iron hinges, swaying gently in the morning breeze that carried the stench of something far worse than ordinary animal waste. Overseer William Brown approached the enclosure at Cottonwood Estate with his usual morning confidence, boots crunching on gravel still wet from the previous night's rain. The Tennessee sun was just beginning to burn through the August mist, casting long shadows across the sprawling plantation that stretched toward the Cumberland River like a kingdom built on suffering and cotton. What he found in the churned mud would become the most talked-about mystery in Blackwood County for decades to come. Fragments of expensive cloth, the kind only wealthy men could afford, scattered among the filth like discarded rags. Bone splinters, picked impossibly clean, half buried in the dark earth. The hogs moved restlessly near the fence line, their snouts stained with something that definitely was not their usual morning slop. And there, catching the first rays of sunlight, like a beacon of horror, lay a gold signet ring engraved with the initials A.D. Alexander Davis, the master of Cottonwood Estate. A man who had ruled his 300 acres and 62 enslaved souls with an iron fist for 23 years. A man who had been inspecting his cotton gin the previous evening, celebrating another profitable harvest season with imported brandy and the satisfaction of a landowner who believed his empire was unshakable. Brown's breakfast threatened to rise in his throat as the terrible understanding crashed over him like a wave of ice water. Someone had butchered Master Davis and fed him to his own livestock, the animals he had valued more than the human beings who built his fortune with their blood and sweat. The hogs that received better medical care than the people who worked his fields from sunrise to sunset. The night before, Davis had been walking these same grounds with his characteristic swagger, leather riding crop tucked under his arm like a badge of authority. 3 nights ago, he had used that same crop on a field hand named Marcus Tharvin, delivering 40 lashes for the crime of requesting an extra water break during the brutal August heat. The welts on Marcus's back had still been weeping blood and clear fluid yesterday morning. Now Davis was gone, transformed into scattered evidence of violence that spoke to meticulous planning and cold-blooded execution. Where are you watching from right now? What county? What state? Drop a comment below and tell me your location. And if stories like this grip you by the throat and refuse to let go, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Because what you are about to hear has been buried in courthouse archives and historical society basements for over 170 years. The truth has been sanitized, whitewashed, and deliberately forgotten by those who wanted to pretend such things never happened on American soil. Brown stumbled backward from the hog pen, his mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same terrifying conclusion. This was not the work of wild animals or wandering bandits. This was not an accident or a tragic misunderstanding. The evidence told a story of systematic butchering, of someone who knew exactly how to reduce a human body to manageable pieces. Someone who understood animal feeding patterns well enough to know the hogs would destroy any remaining evidence of the crime. The enslaved population of Cottonwood Estate was already gathering for morning roll call, their faces carefully blank as they watched the overseer's obvious panic unfold. They stood in their usual formation between the quarters and the main house, 62 souls pretending not to notice that something catastrophic had occurred during the night. The morning air hung heavy with unspoken knowledge, with the weight of collective secrets that bound them together more tightly than any chain. But Marcus Tharvin was not among them. His usual place in the third row, between James Smith and Joseph Taylor, stood conspicuously empty. Brown's hand found the pistol at his belt as he scanned the assembled workers, his eyes darting from face to carefully neutral face. The ancient oak trees that lined the property swayed in the morning breeze, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that had witnessed decades of brutality and now observed this moment with the same silent patience. "Where is Marcus?" Brown's voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear that was beginning to override his usual confidence. The silence that followed his question stretched tight as a rope about to snap. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird began its morning song, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below its perch. Old Samuel Thompson, the eldest field hand at 67 years, finally spoke. His voice carried the smooth quality of someone who had survived by knowing exactly what to reveal and what to conceal. "Have not seen him since yesterday evening, sir. Figured he was still recovering in the quarters from his whipping. Man took 40 lashes after all. That kind of punishment takes time to heal from." The lie fell smooth as honey, delivered with just the right mixture of deference and concern. These people had survived by becoming invisible, by mastering the art of strategic ignorance. But Brown caught something in their collective stillness, a quality of attention that suggested they knew far more than their carefully blank expressions revealed. They were watching him with the focused intensity of people waiting to see what would happen next, already prepared for whatever consequences might follow. Blood feeds the earth, and the earth remembers. What had really happened in those dark hours between sunset and dawn? How does a man simply vanish from his own property, leaving behind only bone fragments and a gold ring half buried in hog pen mud? The answers lay hidden somewhere in the quarters, whispered between people who had learned that survival meant swallowing truth until it threatened to poison you from within. But Marcus was not the only thing missing from Cottonwood Estate that morning. Master Davis's favorite skinning knife, the one he used for dressing deer during hunting season, was gone from its display case in his study. The heavy meat cleaver from the kitchen house had vanished from its hook beside the fireplace. Someone had come prepared for the night's work, armed with tools sharp enough and strong enough to reduce a full-grown man to pieces small enough for hogs to consume. The real question was not who had done this terrible thing. In a place where 62 people suffered under one man's casual cruelty, the list of those with motive was as long as the property line itself. The real question was how long they had been planning it, how many people were involved, and whether Alexander Davis would be the only master to disappear into the darkness of revenge disguised as animal hunger. Because in the growing light of that August morning, one thing became terrifyingly clear to William Brown as he stood in the shadow of the hog pen. The animals were still hungry. And there were more masters in Tennessee who ruled their plantations with whips and chains, and the absolute certainty that their property would never dare to fight back. Before we go any further into this story, I need you to understand something crucial about what you are about to hear. This is not entertainment. This is not fiction dressed up as history. What happened at Cottonwood Estate in August of 1852 represents a moment when the carefully maintained fiction of the plantation system cracked open, revealing the raw truth that those in power spent decades trying to bury. The events that unfolded on that Tennessee property challenge everything we have been taught about the antebellum South. The comfortable narratives about loyal servants and benevolent masters. The sanitized versions of history that skip over the daily brutality that defined life on cotton plantations. What you are about to discover is the story of a man pushed beyond the breaking point, who made a choice that would echo through Tennessee counties for generations. Think about where you are right now as you watch this. Sitting in your home. Probably comfortable, probably safe. Now imagine that safety stripped away. Imagine waking up every morning, knowing that your body does not belong to you, that any mistake could result in public whipping, that your life has exactly as much value as a piece of farm equipment. Imagine living that way not for days or weeks, but for years. For decades. Imagine watching the same man who claims to own you treat his livestock with more care and consideration than he shows to you or anyone who looks like you. How long would you last before something inside you broke? Before the part of your mind that counsels patience and survival gave way to something darker and more desperate? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones if we want to understand what happened at Cottonwood Estate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If stories like this fascinate you, if you believe that buried history deserves to be unearthed and examined, then hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment telling me what state you are watching from, because this story is not just about Tennessee. Similar events happened across the South, but they were systematically erased from official records, dismissed as isolated incidents, or blamed on outside agitators, rather than acknowledging the possibility that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence and the determination to seek their own justice. The courthouse records from Blackwood County were sealed in 1867, locked away in basement storage where they gathered dust alongside other documents deemed too dangerous for public consumption. Those files remained hidden until 1983, when a graduate student researching Tennessee plantation economics stumbled across them by accident. What she found contradicted every sanitized version of history she had been taught. The documents detailed not just the disappearance of Alexander Davis, but a pattern of similar incidents across western Tennessee. Plantation owners who died in suspicious accidents. Overseers found dead in cotton gins or at the bottom of wells. Masters who simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and fear. The authorities had connected these deaths by 1853, but admitting that enslaved people were capable of organized resistance would have undermined the entire ideological foundation of the plantation system. So the files were sealed, the stories were suppressed, the pattern was officially declared to be coincidental, and men like Alexander Davis were mourned as victims of tragic accidents, rather than casualties of a conflict they had helped create through their own brutality. What you need to understand about Alexander Davis is that he was not exceptional. He was not unusually cruel by the standards of his time and place. He was simply doing what plantation owners throughout the South did every day, maintaining control through violence and the constant threat of violence. He broke up families at auction. He ordered public whippings for minor infractions. He worked his human property from dawn until dark during harvest season, then complained when exhaustion led to mistakes that required punishment. He was, by the standards of his community, a successful and respected landowner. He served on the county board, he attended church every Sunday. He donated money to build a new schoolhouse for white children in the nearest town. And he saw absolutely no contradiction between his public piety and his private brutality. Because the system told him that enslaved people were not fully human, that they required firm discipline, that kindness would be interpreted as weakness. Marcus Tharvin had endured 15 years under that system. 15 years of watching Davis treat his prized breeding hogs with more consideration than he showed to the people who built his wealth. 15 years of swallowing rage and humiliation and pain while maintaining the mask of submission that was necessary for survival. But 40 lashes for requesting water on a day when the temperature reached 98 degrees had finally broken something inside Marcus. Not his spirit, which had been battered and bruised years earlier. Something deeper than spirit. The part of him that still believed survival required accepting the unacceptable. What happened next would become legend in slave quarters across Tennessee, whispered in coded songs and careful conversations. It would inspire others to seek similar justice. It would force plantation owners to modify their behavior, to vary their routines, to acknowledge that their property might possess the capacity for strategic violence. But it would also result in a crackdown that would scatter families and destroy communities. It would lead to increased surveillance and harsher punishments for any sign of resistance. Because the one thing the plantation system could not tolerate was the idea that enslaved people possessed agency, that they could think and plan and execute complicated schemes of revenge. So buckle in, because what comes next is not a comfortable story. It is not a tale of heroes and villains in the simple sense. It is the story of what happens when human beings are pushed past the point where survival matters more than vengeance. When the calculation shifts from, how do I live through this, to, how do I make them pay for what they have done? This is the story of Marcus Tharvin, and the night he fed his master to the hogs. Marcus Tharvin's back bore 40 fresh stripes from Wednesday's whipping. each welt a testament to Alexander Davis's precision with leather and calculated cruelty. The sound of cicadas buzzed through the slave quarters that Thursday evening, mixing with the smell of wood smoke from cooking fires and the rough texture of corn shuck mattresses beneath fevered skin. This is how transformation begins, one lash at a time, until flesh becomes rage, and rage becomes cold calculation. Marcus had been purchased at auction in Nashville 15 years earlier, in the spring of 1837, when he was barely 22 years old. He had been born free in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith who had taught him to read and write before everything changed. His father had been killed in a workshop accident when Marcus was 19. His mother had died of fever the following winter. And Marcus, grieving and alone, had made the catastrophic mistake of traveling south to find work, carrying papers that proved his free status. Those papers had been stolen his first night in Kentucky. By the second night he had been captured by slave catchers who saw only profit in a strong young man with skilled hands. By the third night he was in chains, his protests of freedom dismissed as the desperate lies of a runaway. Within a week he stood on an auction block in Nashville, sold to Alexander Davis for $800. 15 years. That was how long Marcus had endured Cottonwood Estate. 15 years of watching the sun rise over cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon like an ocean of white. 15 years of picking until his fingers bled, of carrying water to other workers who collapsed from heat exhaustion, of listening to families torn apart when Davis decided to sell someone's wife or husband or parent to pay off gambling debts. His crime on Wednesday had been simple and desperate. The temperature had climbed to 98 degrees by mid-afternoon. The water barrel at the edge of the field had run dry an hour earlier. Marcus had paused in his picking, straightened his aching back, and walked toward William Brown to request that someone be sent to refill the barrel before another worker collapsed from the heat. Davis had been inspecting the fields that day, riding his chestnut mare along the rows while carrying his leather crop like a scepter of authority. He had overheard Marcus's request and interpreted it as insubordination, as a challenge to the natural order that placed him above and Marcus below. The whipping had been public and methodical. 40 lashes delivered in front of every field hand, each stroke carefully spaced to maximize pain while avoiding permanent damage to valuable property. Davis had counted aloud as he worked, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, as if he were tallying bales of cotton rather than destroying human flesh. Marcus had endured it without crying out, biting down on the leather strap they had given him until his teeth left permanent marks in the hide. He had learned years ago that screaming only encouraged Davis to continue longer, that the master took pleasure in breaking people's will along with their skin. But something had broken inside Marcus during that whipping, not his will, which had been tested and hardened by 15 years of bondage. Something more fundamental. The part of him that still believed tomorrow would come, that survival was worth the daily humiliation and pain, that somewhere beyond this nightmare there might be a future worth enduring for. Old Samuel Thompson had tended Marcus's wounds that Wednesday evening, using poultices made from stolen kitchen herbs and creek water boiled over a carefully controlled fire. His weathered hands were gentle despite their decades of hard labor, his movements practiced from years of treating similar injuries. "You need to rest now," Samuel had said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only Marcus could hear. "Fever will come tonight. It always does after a whipping like that. You need to drink water and stay still and let your body do its healing work." But the fever that burned through Marcus that night was not caused by infection. It came from somewhere deeper, fueled by rage that had been accumulating for 15 years like water behind a dam. His delirious mutterings revealed plans that should have remained buried in silence, thoughts that dangerous men keep locked away in the darkest corners of their minds. "Going to make him pay," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the August wind that rattled through the loose board walls of the quarters. "Going to feed him to his own hogs, going to watch them eat every piece, going to make sure there is nothing left but bones and blood and satisfaction." Samuel Thompson heard these words and said nothing. He had lived 67 years by knowing when to speak and when to maintain strategic silence. He continued applying his poultices and offering water, his face revealing nothing of the calculations happening behind his eyes. From a plantation ledger dated August 6, 1852, field hand Marcus requires medical attention following disciplinary action for insubordination. Expect reduced productivity for 3 to 5 days. Consider sale to Deep South Plantation if attitude does not improve with proper correction. What the ledger did not record was Marcus's transformation. The fever that burned through him carried away his last restraints, his final connections to the person he had been before Wednesday's whipping. When the fever broke near midnight on Thursday, Marcus's eyes opened with a clarity that had been absent for years. He rose from his mattress like a man resurrected, his movements purposeful despite the agony radiating from his shredded back. He moved through the quarters with a presence that made other enslaved people step aside without understanding why. They recognized something in his expression, in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands flexed as if testing their strength. It was the look of a man who had passed beyond fear into a place where consequences no longer mattered, where the only calculation that remained was how to inflict maximum damage before the inevitable end came. The reckoning comes at night. Marcus knew Davis's routines with the precision of someone whose life had depended for 15 years on predicting his master's movements. Every Thursday evening, Davis would inspect the cotton gin house after supper, checking machinery and tallying the week's production numbers. He walked the same path. He carried the same lantern. He spent exactly 45 minutes among the wooden gears and iron presses that processed enslaved labor into his personal profit. The kitchen house sat between the slave quarters and the gin house, its door always unlocked for the cook's pre-dawn duties. Marcus had watched Abigail Anderson sharpen knives countless times while waiting to carry firewood or deliver water. He had memorized where she kept her heaviest cleaver, which blade held the best edge, how the tools felt when lifted from their hooks. The tools of food preparation could serve other purposes when necessity demanded innovation, when survival gave way to something darker and more final than mere existence. But Marcus's plan required more than weapons. It demanded perfect timing, absolute silence, and the kind of cold calculation that 15 years of brutality had taught him. He had learned to think like prey in order to survive. Now he would think like a predator in order to kill. The other enslaved people at Cottonwood Estate sensed the change in Marcus without fully understanding its source. They gave him wider space during evening meal. They avoided direct eye contact when he passed. They pretended not to notice when he slipped away from the evening prayer gathering that served as their only sanctioned community time. Some suspected what was coming. None interfered. Because in the brutal arithmetic of plantation life, one master's death might mean salvation for 62 souls. Or it might mean collective punishment that would make Wednesday's whipping look like mercy. The calculation was impossible to make with certainty, but the possibility of liberation outweighed the guarantee of continued suffering. What would you have done, knowing what Marcus planned? Would you have warned Davis, hoping that preventing murder might earn favor or reduced punishment? Would you have tried to talk Marcus out of his plan, counseling patience and survival over revenge and certain death? Or would you have looked the other way, choosing the slim possibility of freedom over the certainty of endless bondage? The moon was dark that Thursday night, August 6, 1852, providing perfect cover as Marcus made his way toward the kitchen house. His bare feet made no sound on the packed earth paths he had walked thousands of times. Every shadow held familiarity. Every building stood mapped in his memory like a battlefield he had finally decided to claim as his own. Behind him, the slave quarters remained silent as a graveyard, 61 souls pretending to sleep while listening to the sounds of the night. Ahead, Davis's mansion glowed with lamplight, its windows revealing the master's evening routine, reading agricultural journals, counting money, planning tomorrow's work assignments with the casual efficiency of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human beings. But Marcus carried questions of his own now, questions sharp as the blades he would soon claim from the kitchen house. Questions about justice and revenge, and whether a man's life could be measured in the pieces that remained after hogs finished their feeding. Questions about what freedom tasted like when purchased with blood and bone, and the absolute destruction of everything his master had believed was permanent and unshakable. The kitchen door opened without resistance, welcoming Marcus into the space where his final transformation would be completed. Tomorrow, Alexander Davis would learn that even hogs have limits to what they will consume. Tonight, Marcus would learn whether revenge could fill the emptiness that 15 years of bondage had carved into his soul. The kitchen house stood silent in the darkness, its wooden walls still holding the day's accumulated heat and the lingering aroma of cornbread that had been baked for the master's evening table. Marcus's calloused fingers traced the rough door frame as he stepped inside, feeling the familiar texture of pine boards that had absorbed decades of cooking smoke and human labor. This is where thoughts crystallize into action, where 15 years of suffering transforms into instruments of revenge. The cleaver hung from its usual hook beside the massive stone fireplace, its edge honed to razor sharpness by Abigail Anderson's meticulous care. She kept her tools pristine, understanding that dull blades meant harder work and longer hours serving appetites she could never personally satisfy. Marcus lifted the cleaver slowly, testing its weight in his right hand, memorizing how the wooden handle settled against his palm like it had been crafted specifically for this moment. The blade caught faint moonlight filtering through the window, throwing a sliver of reflection across the opposite wall. Heavy enough to split chicken bones with a single stroke. Sharp enough to part flesh without requiring the sawing motion that might produce sounds carrying beyond the kitchen walls. Perfect for the work ahead. But one blade would not be sufficient for what Marcus had planned. He needed the skinning knife as well, the one Davis kept displayed in his study like a trophy from his hunting expeditions. That knife had taken deer and wild boar. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose entirely. Marcus had cleaned that study countless times over 15 years, dusting around weapons he had never dared touch until this moment. He knew which floorboards creaked. He knew where Davis kept his brandy and how many glasses the master typically consumed on Thursday evenings. He knew the man's habits with the precision born from years of forced observation, the kind of knowledge that prey develops about predators when survival depends on predicting their movements. The main house loomed ahead as Marcus crossed the yard, the cleaver hidden beneath the loose shirt he wore. Every window glowed with lamplight, but Marcus knew the patterns. Davis would be in his study on the second floor, reviewing ledgers and sipping imported brandy until precisely 9:30. Then he would extinguish the lamps, walk downstairs, and begin his evening inspection of the property. The servants' entrance at the rear of the house remained unlocked until Davis made his rounds. Another predictable routine, another vulnerability the master had never considered, might be exploited by the human property he believed too broken to threaten him. Marcus moved through the darkened hallways with the confidence of familiarity. His bare feet made no sound on the wooden floors he had scrubbed thousands of times. He knew which doors stuck and which opened silently. He knew where shadows pooled deepest and which roots avoided the windows where lamplight might reveal his presence. The study door stood ajar, exactly as Marcus had known it would be. Davis never fully closed it during his evening routine, a small gesture of the absolute security he felt within his own domain. The skinning knife rested in its display case beside a collection of other hunting implements, each tool representing the master's dominion over creatures he considered beneath human consideration. Marcus's hand closed around the knife's handle, lifting it free with movements so smooth they produced no sound whatsoever. The blade was longer than he had remembered, nearly 10 inches of folded steel that tapered to a point designed for piercing hide and separating meat from bone. Combined with the cleaver, he now possessed everything necessary to reduce a man to pieces small enough for Hogs to consume completely. From the Journal of Dr. Christopher Thomas, county physician, later dated August 8, 1852, called to examine remains discovered at Cottonwood Estate. Preliminary assessment suggests systematic dismemberment performed by individual with knowledge of animal butchering techniques. Precision of cuts indicates familiarity with anatomy and access to professionally maintained blades. Marcus had learned those butchering techniques through 15 years of forced practice. Field hands were regularly assigned to slaughter hogs for plantation feasts, required to transform living animals into meat portions that would grace tables where they would never be invited to sit. He had developed unwanted expertise through repetition, each cut teaching him lessons about anatomy he had never desired to learn. Now those lessons would serve a purpose their original teachers had never imagined. The same skills used to prepare food for Davis's table would be used to prepare Davis himself for an entirely different kind of consumption. The cotton gin house provided ideal cover for the work ahead. Its location at the edge of the property meant sounds would not carry to the slave quarters or the main house. Its machinery created ambient noise throughout the night as cotton continued processing through wooden gears and iron rollers, the mechanical sounds providing acoustic camouflage for other activities requiring privacy and time. Marcus had studied Davis's Thursday inspection routine with obsessive attention to detail. The master would arrive at the gin house at precisely 9:45, carrying his brass lantern and a small notebook for recording production figures. He would spend 45 minutes checking machinery, examining cotton samples, and calculating profits. He would be alone, as he always was during these inspections, believing his authority and the surrounding darkness provided sufficient security. 9:45. That was when Davis would enter the gin house through the main door, his attention focused on the machinery and ledgers that represented his wealth. 9:46. That was when Marcus would be waiting in the shadows behind the cotton press, blades ready, every muscle prepared for the explosive violence that would end 15 years of bondage in a matter of seconds. The psychology of killing requires crossing a threshold most humans never approach. Marcus had spent 15 years being brutalized, each incident teaching him lessons about power and its absence. But observation works in multiple directions. While Davis had been systematically breaking Marcus's body, Marcus had been studying Davis's vulnerabilities with the focused attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding his tormentor completely. Davis's arthritis made his left hand weak, reducing his ability to defend against attacks from that side. His advancing age had slowed his reflexes, creating a gap between perception and response that a younger man could exploit. His arrogance made him predictable, following routines that announced his location to anyone paying sufficient attention. His absolute certainty in his own authority had blinded him to the possibility that his property might possess both intelligence and homicidal intent. These weaknesses had been invisible to Davis, who viewed enslaved people as tools rather than thinking beings capable of strategic planning and calculated violence. That blindness would cost him everything he believed permanent and unshakable. Other plantations across Tennessee had experienced similar incidents, though the details were usually suppressed to prevent panic among the white population. Overseers discovered dead in cotton fields, their deaths attributed to heart failure despite suspicious circumstances. Masters found at the bottom of wells, the railings conveniently broken. House servants who simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and mounting fear among those who remained. The authorities inevitably blamed these incidents on runaway slaves or outside agitators, unwilling to acknowledge the possibility that their victims might be planning their own justice. But Marcus understood what those officials refused to see. Every act of brutality created the possibility of retaliation. Every whipping planted seeds of rage that might take years to germinate but would eventually produce bitter fruit. His plan extended beyond simple murder. Marcus intended to erase Davis completely, to reduce him to scattered fragments that could never be properly buried or mourned. The Hogs would accomplish what no court ever could, delivering a verdict that could not be appealed or overturned by any legal authority. What drives a human being to such methodical cruelty? Was Marcus still fully human after 15 years of dehumanization? Or had Davis's brutality transformed him into something else entirely? An instrument shaped by suffering into a weapon of perfect revenge? These questions had no comfortable answers, only the recognition that systems built on violence inevitably produce violent responses. The church bell in Blackwood County chimed 9 times as Marcus made his final preparations. He had hidden the blades earlier near the gin house, wrapped in burlap and concealed beneath loose floorboards in a storage shed. Now he retrieved them, feeling their weight settle into his hands like extensions of his own body, tools that had become part of his identity as surely as the scars on his back. Davis's lantern appeared in the distance, a small point of light bobbing through darkness toward the gin house. The master walked with the confident stride of a man who had never imagined his property might possess sufficient intelligence and determination to plan elaborate vengeance. He carried his notebook under one arm and his brass lantern in the other, humming slightly as he approached the building that would become his final destination. In less than 1 hour, Alexander Davis would discover that some lessons can only be taught once, that authority built on violence contains the seeds of its own destruction. Marcus stepped deeper into the shadows beside the cotton press, blades ready, heartbeat steady as stone. despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The teacher was about to become the student in a classroom where graduation meant feeding time at the hog pen, where diplomas were written in blood and bone, where the final examination would be conducted by animals that cared nothing for the distinctions between master and meat that human society considered so critically important. The door handle turned with a metallic click that seemed impossibly loud in the night silence. Marcus's fingers tightened around the cleaver's wooden handle. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, compressed to its absolute limit. This was the moment when 15 years of rage would be released in a matter of seconds, when victim would become executioner, and the natural order that Davis believed unshakable would be violently inverted. The door swung open. Lamplight spilled across the gin house floor, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended in the still air like frozen stars. Davis stepped inside, completely unaware that he was walking into an ambush that had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail he applied to calculating his cotton profits. Behind the cotton press, Marcus Tharvin waited with the patience of someone who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to a human being, who had nothing left to lose except the opportunity for revenge that was now finally within reach. The predator preparing to strike. The student ready to teach his master one final lesson about the consequences of treating human beings like disposable property. The cotton gin machinery filled the night with its familiar grinding rhythm, wooden gears meshing with iron components in the eternal process of separating fiber from seed. Alexander Davis stepped fully into the building at 9:44, 1 minute ahead of his usual schedule, carrying his brass lantern in his right hand and his production notebook tucked under his left arm. The lamplight cast dancing shadows across the machinery, creating patterns that shifted and moved like living things across the walls and ceiling. Marcus pressed himself deeper into the darkness behind the cotton press, controlling his breathing with the discipline born from 15 years of learning to hide everything he felt behind a mask of submission. The cleaver felt weightless in his right hand now, as if it had become part of his body rather than a separate tool. The skinning knife waited in his belt, ready for the precision work that would follow the initial violence. Davis moved toward his usual inspection position near the main processing equipment, setting his lantern on a wooden table scarred by years of use. He opened his notebook and began recording figures, his attention completely absorbed by the numbers that represented his wealth. Cotton processed per hour, bales ready for market. Projected profits from this week's production. The mathematics of human suffering converted into monetary gain. The master's back was completely exposed, vulnerable in ways he had never imagined possible. His expensive coat stretched tight across his shoulders. The fabric, tailored in Memphis by craftsmen who would never know their work, would soon be torn and bloodied beyond any possibility of repair. His neck was bare above his collar, the pale skin practically glowing in the lamplight, marking the exact spot where blade would meet flesh. Marcus stepped from the shadows like death taking physical form. 3 steps across sawdust-covered floor, moving with speed that seemed impossible for someone whose back still wept from Wednesday's whipping. The cleaver rose in a smooth arc, catching brief lamplight reflection before it descended, with all the accumulated force of 15 years of rage compressed into a single explosive moment. The blade struck between Davis's shoulder blades with a sound like an axe biting into hardwood. The master's notebook fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, pages fluttering across the floor like wounded birds. His mouth opened to scream, but Marcus's left hand clamped over it with crushing force, cutting off any sound that might carry beyond the gin house walls. The skinning knife came free from Marcus's belt in one fluid motion, the blade finding its mark beneath Davis's ribs, angled upward toward the heart with the precision of someone who had butchered hundreds of hogs and understood exactly where to cut for maximum effect. Blood sprayed across the production ledger on the table, transforming careful calculations into abstract patterns painted in crimson. Davis struggled with the desperate strength of a man fighting for his life, his hands clawing at Marcus's arm, his body thrashing in the grip that held him upright. But 15 years of fieldwork had given Marcus strength that no amount of comfortable living could match. His muscles were iron from dawn to dusk labor. His will was harder than the Tennessee limestone that formed the county's bedrock. The master's movements grew weaker as blood loss sapped his strength. His clawing became feeble pawing. His thrashing subsided into trembling. His eyes, visible in the lamplight, shifted from shock to confusion to terror, to a kind of disbelief that this could possibly be happening, that his property had become his executioner. From Adams County Sheriff records, later dated August 9, 1852, Master Alexander Davis of Cottonwood Estate reported missing. Last observed conducting evening inspection of Cotton Gin House. No signs of struggle discovered at initial scene examination. Field hand Marcus Tharvin, also missing from morning roll call. Reward offered for information leading to recovery of property and apprehension of suspect. But there had been struggle, carefully and methodically erased by hands that understood the critical importance of leaving no evidence that might lead investigators to uncomfortable truths. Marcus had worked through the night with the same focused attention Davis had once demanded during cotton harvest, using skills learned from years of slaughtering plantation livestock for master's feasts. The hardest part had not been the killing itself, which had taken less than 10 minutes from first strike to final breath. The hardest part had been the waiting afterward, watching Davis's eyes fade through their progression from arrogance to awareness to emptiness. Marcus had studied that transition like a scholar examining an important text, memorizing each stage of the master's death, with the intensity of someone who wanted to remember every detail of this moment for whatever time remained to him. Masters bleed exactly like anyone else. Their blood is the same color. Their bodies fail in the same ways when pierced by sharp metal. Their eyes go empty with the same finality when life drains away. This was the lesson Marcus had learned in those 10 minutes, the knowledge that would sustain him through whatever came next. The dismemberment required 4 hours of patient, methodical work. Marcus had spread canvas tarps stolen from the equipment shed across the gin house floor, creating a workspace where blood could be contained and later disposed of without leaving permanent stains. He had positioned Davis's body in the center of this improvised butcher's station, arranging the limbs for easy access to the major joints. He had studied anatomy through necessity, learning which connections separated cleanly and which required careful sawing through bone. The shoulders came free with relative ease, the ball and socket joints yielding to the skinning knife when approached from the correct angle. The hips required more effort, the larger bones and thicker muscles demanding multiple cuts before the legs could be fully detached. Marcus worked with the calm efficiency of someone performing a familiar task, his mind oddly quiet despite the magnitude of what he was doing. There was no room for emotion in this work, no space for doubt or hesitation. Only the mechanical process of reducing a human body to manageable pieces that could be transported and disposed of without detection. He separated the torso into sections, cutting through the spine at carefully selected points. He removed the head last, using the cleaver to strike through the neck vertebrae after the skinning knife had parted the surrounding tissue. Davis's face remained frozen in an expression somewhere between surprise and outrage, as if even in death he could not quite believe that his property had destroyed him so completely. Each piece was wrapped in burlap, the rough fabric absorbing blood and other fluids that might otherwise leave a trail. Marcus loaded them methodically into a wheelbarrow normally used for transporting cotton bales, the same equipment that had carried the products of enslaved labor now carrying the master who had profited from that labor. The load felt heavier than expected, as if death itself possessed physical weight beyond the mere mass of flesh and bone. Marcus pushed the wheelbarrow across the property with steady determination, following paths he had walked thousands of times, moving through shadows that had witnessed 15 years of his bondage and now witnessed his transformation into something beyond victim or survivor. The hog pen sat 75 yards from the gin house, far enough to muffle sounds but close enough for efficient transport. Davis's prized breeding stock had been fed their evening meal at sunset, but hogs were creatures of endless appetite, omnivorous animals that would consume nearly anything placed before them if properly motivated. They gathered at the fence as Marcus approached, their small eyes reflecting starlight with primitive intelligence that suggested they sensed something unusual was about to occur. The largest boar, a massive creature that Davis had valued at nearly $200, pushed its snout through the fence rails, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of blood on the night air. What followed challenged every notion of civilization and human dignity that the plantation system claimed to uphold. Marcus unwrapped the first bundle and tossed its contents over the fence into the churned mud of the pen. The hogs descended on the offering with enthusiastic violence, their powerful jaws crushing bone and tearing flesh with efficiency born from generations of selective breeding for size and aggression. They made no distinction between this meat and any other. They possessed no moral framework that distinguished acceptable from forbidden consumption. They were simply animals following their nature, converting organic matter into energy and growth with the same indifference they showed to everything else placed before them. Bundle after bundle disappeared into the feeding frenzy. The hogs fought each other for access to the unexpected feast, their grunts and squeals creating a soundtrack of savage consumption that would haunt Marcus's dreams for whatever remained of his life. But he watched without flinching, forcing himself to witness every moment of what he had set in motion, refusing to look away from the consequences of his revenge. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten from black to deep purple, only fragments remained, bone splinters too small for certain identification. Cloth scraps ground into mud by hooved feet that had trampled the pin into a wasteland of churned earth and scattered evidence. The gold signet ring that had somehow survived the feeding frenzy lay half buried near the fence line, its engraved initials still visible despite being scratched and stained. Marcus had cleaned the gin house with lye soap stolen from the kitchen, scrubbing every surface where blood might have fallen. He had burned the canvas tarps in the equipment shed's furnace, feeding them slowly into flames hot enough to consume fabric and eliminate the distinctive smell of burning blood. He had washed the blades and returned them to their proper locations, the cleaver to its kitchen hook and the skinning knife to its display case. As dawn broke over Cottonwood Estate, Marcus stood at the edge of the property, looking north toward freedom he would never be allowed to reach through legitimate means. Behind him lay the remains of the man who had owned him for 15 years, scattered in a hog pen, where they would be discovered in a few hours by an overseer who would struggle to comprehend what his eyes were showing him. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, the possibility of escape balanced against the probability of capture and execution. But Marcus felt lighter than he had in 15 years, as if the weight he had been carrying had finally been lifted, even though he knew the consequences of his actions would be severe and probably fatal. He had tasted something in those dark hours between sunset and dawn that he had never experienced during his years of bondage. Not freedom exactly, because freedom remained impossibly distant, but power, agency, the knowledge that masters were not invincible, that they could be reduced to meat and bones just like any other creature when circumstances and determination aligned properly. And knowledge like that, once gained, could never be erased or forgotten. It would live in Marcus whether he survived the next day or the next hour. It would spread to others through whispered conversations and coded songs. It would plant seeds of possibility in minds that had been carefully taught to accept powerlessness as permanent and unchangeable. The sun rose over Tennessee cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward a horizon suddenly transformed by the events of a single night. Marcus Tharvin turned away from the plantation that had been his prison and began walking north, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the memory of watching his master disappear into the bellies of animals that knew no difference between master and meat, between human and any other form of organic matter suitable for consumption. Behind him, the hogs in their pen began their morning routine, restless and agitated in ways that would never fully subside, as if they had consumed something that changed them fundamentally, that gave them knowledge or memory beyond what animals were supposed to possess. The morning mist hung thick over Cottonwood Estate on August 7, 1852, carrying with it the humid promise of another scorching Tennessee day and something else, something metallic and wrong that made William Brown pause at the edge of the property before beginning his usual morning inspection. The overseer had slept poorly, troubled by dreams he could not quite remember upon waking, images of darkness and violence that left him unsettled as he pulled on his boots and prepared for another day of managing Davis's human property. The slave quarters were already stirring as Brown made his way toward the main house. Smoke rose from cooking fires as the enslaved population prepared their meager breakfast rations before the workday began. Everything appeared normal on the surface, the same routines that had repeated themselves every morning for years, but something felt different in a way Brown could not quite articulate. He reached the main house at 6:15, expecting to find Davis already awake and planning the day's assignments over coffee and cornbread. Instead, the house stood silent. No lamplight glowed in the study windows. No sounds of movement came from within. Brown knocked on the front door, waited, knocked again with increasing force. Nothing. A cold sensation began spreading through Brown's chest, something that felt like the first whisper of genuine fear. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Davis sometimes forgot to secure the entrance after his evening inspections, confident that no enslaved person would dare enter the main house without explicit permission. Brown moved through the silent rooms calling his employer's name, his voice echoing off walls decorated with paintings and mirrors that reflected his growing anxiety back at him. The study was empty. The bedroom showed no signs that anyone had slept there during the night. The dining room table remained set for a breakfast that had never been consumed. It was 7:30 when Brown finally reached the Cotton Gin House, his mind racing through increasingly dire possibilities. Perhaps Davis had fallen ill during his inspection and was lying unconscious somewhere on the property. Perhaps he had been thrown from his horse during a late-night ride, though that seemed unlikely given the master's habitual routines. Perhaps something far worse had occurred, something that Brown's mind shied away from considering too directly. The gin house door stood slightly ajar, moving gently in the morning breeze. Brown pushed it open fully and stepped inside, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dimmer interior light. Everything appeared normal at first glance. The machinery stood ready for another day of processing. The production ledger lay on its table, though Brown noticed with growing unease that several pages appeared stained with something dark that might have been spilled ink or coffee. Davis's brass lantern sat exactly where it always did during inspections, the oil reservoir empty, the wick burned down to nothing. But Davis himself was nowhere to be seen. Brown searched the building methodically, checking behind equipment and in storage areas, finding nothing except a faint smell that reminded him uncomfortably of the plantation's slaughtering shed after hog butchering days. By 8 o'clock, Brown had assembled the entire enslaved population for emergency roll call. 62 people lined up in their usual formation, their faces revealing nothing, as the overseer counted heads with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. The mathematics of the head count confirmed what Brown had already begun to suspect. One person was missing from the assembly. Marcus Tharvin's place in the third row stood empty, the man who had been whipped 3 days earlier for requesting water during brutal heat. The man who had spent Thursday recovering from injuries that should have kept him bedridden for at least a week. The man who now appeared to have vanished, along with the master who had ordered his punishment. "Where is Marcus?" Brown's voice came out higher and tighter than he intended, betraying the fear that was rapidly overtaking his usual confidence. He scanned the assembled faces, looking for any sign of knowledge or guilt or satisfaction that might reveal what had happened during the night. The silence that followed his question felt absolute, as if the entire world had stopped breathing while waiting to see what would happen next. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the cotton fields stretching endlessly in all directions. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed its morning announcement, oblivious to the human drama unfolding beneath its perch. Old Samuel Thompson finally stepped forward, his weathered face arranged in an expression of carefully crafted concern that revealed nothing of whatever thoughts might be occurring behind his eyes. "Have not seen Marcus since Thursday evening, sir," he said, his voice carrying the appropriate mixture of deference and worry. "Man was in terrible condition after his whipping. Fever came on Thursday night, broke sometime around midnight. When I checked his palate this morning before dawn, he was gone. Figured maybe he wandered off in delirium, not knowing where he was going or what he was doing." The explanation was plausible, even reasonable given the circumstances. Men with high fevers sometimes became disoriented and wandered away from their quarters. It happened occasionally, usually ending with the delirious person being found collapsed somewhere on the property, confused but otherwise unharmed. But Brown's instincts, honed by 8 years of managing enslaved labor, told him this situation was different in ways he could not yet fully articulate. Did anyone else see or hear anything unusual during the night? Brown's eyes swept across the assembled faces, searching for the slightest crack in their collective facade of ignorance. Any sounds from the direction of the gin house? Any movement around the property after curfew? More silence, stretching tight as a rope pulled to its breaking point. Then heads began shaking in careful negation. "No, sir, nothing unusual. Slept through the night like always. Heard nothing beyond the normal sounds of machinery and animals and wind moving through the trees." Brown knew they were lying. He could feel it in the quality of their stillness, in the way their eyes avoided his while managing to appear appropriately subservient. These people knew something, had seen something, understood far more than they were revealing. But extracting truth from enslaved people who had survived by learning to hide their knowledge behind masks of ignorance was nearly impossible without methods that Brown found distasteful even by the brutal standards of plantation discipline. He dismissed them to their morning work assignments, watching as they dispersed to the fields and various workstations with movements that seemed simultaneously too casual and too controlled. They were performing normalcy, acting out the routines of an ordinary day, while something extraordinary lurked beneath the surface of their collective behavior. Brown's next action was to search Marcus's living space in the slave quarters, a small section of packed earth floor and rough wooden walls that the missing man had occupied for 15 years. He found nothing of significance, no hidden weapons, no evidence of planning or preparation, just the usual meager possessions of an enslaved field hand. A spare shirt, worn thin from years of washing, a wooden bowl and spoon, a corn shuck mattress that still bore the indentation of a body but offered no clues about where that body had gone. It was 9:30 when Brown finally walked toward the hog pen, drawn by an intuition he could not explain and did not want to trust. The morning sun had burned away the last of the mist, revealing the property in harsh clarity that seemed to emphasize every detail with unnatural sharpness. The hogs were more restless than usual, moving in agitated circles around their enclosure, grunting and snorting with an energy that suggested they had been disturbed by something during the night. Brown leaned against the fence, scanning the churned mud of the pen with growing unease. At first, everything appeared normal. Just the usual mess of a hog enclosure, trampled earth mixed with waste and scattered feed. But then his eyes caught something that made his breath stop in his throat. Something that glinted in the sunlight with the unmistakable gleam of gold. He climbed over the fence with hands that had gone suddenly numb, his boots sinking into mud that felt too thick and too dark for ordinary dirt mixed with water. The gold object was a signet ring, engraved with initials that Brown recognized immediately. E.D. Alexander Davis. The ring the master wore every day, the symbol of his authority and status, now half buried in hog pen muck and scratched as if it had been subjected to tremendous force. Brown's eyes swept the enclosure with new horror, seeing details he had initially dismissed as unremarkable. The scattered fragments of expensive cloth that no field hand would ever possess. The bone splinters that seemed too large and too numerous to have come from the hogs' usual feed. The way the animals themselves moved with an unusual restlessness, as if they had consumed something that disagreed with their normal digestion. Understanding crashed over Brown like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his legs threaten to collapse beneath him. Someone had butchered Alexander Davis and fed him to his own livestock. The master who had ruled this plantation with absolute authority for 23 years had been reduced to scattered fragments in the mud, consumed by animals he had valued more than the human beings who built his wealth. Brown stumbled backward from the pen, his mind racing through implications that grew more terrifying with each passing second. This was not a simple murder. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity. This was methodical, calculated revenge, executed with precision, that suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of the master's routines. This was a statement, a message delivered in the most visceral way possible, challenging the entire foundation of the plantation system. The overseer's hands found the fence rail as he fought to steady himself, fought to process information that seemed to fundamentally contradict everything he believed about the natural order of master and enslaved. These people were supposed to be broken, docile, incapable of the kind of strategic thinking required to execute such an elaborate plan. Yet someone had clearly possessed both the intelligence and the determination to reduce a white man to meat and bones, to erase him so completely that almost nothing remained except scattered evidence and mounting horror. By 10 o'clock, Brown had dispatched a rider to Blackwood County to summon the sheriff and whatever assistance could be mustered. The message he sent was carefully worded to convey urgency without revealing the full extent of what had been discovered. Master Davis missing under suspicious circumstances. Field hand Marcus also missing. Request immediate assistance with investigation and property recovery. The enslaved population continued their work in the cotton fields, their movements maintaining the appearance of ordinary productivity. But Brown could feel them watching, could sense their awareness of his discovery and his growing panic. They knew what had happened. They had known since morning roll call, possibly since the moment Marcus had returned to the quarters in the hours before dawn. They were complicit through their silence, accessories to a crime that could result in collective punishment affecting every person on the property. What should the response be to such an act? How could the system maintain control when its fundamental assumptions about power and submission had been so violently challenged? These questions haunted Brown as he waited for authorities to arrive, questions that had no comfortable answers within the framework of beliefs he had been taught since childhood. Sheriff Jonathan Walker arrived at noon with 4 deputies and a professional slave catcher named Ryan Robinson, whose reputation for tracking runaways extended across 3 states. They examined the hog pen with expressions that shifted from skepticism to disgust to a kind of fear that transcended professional detachment. This was not a crime they had been trained to investigate. This was something that challenged their understanding of social order and natural hierarchy. Robinson spent an hour examining the slave quarters and interviewing selected individuals, employing techniques designed to break through collective silence. He separated people from their usual groups, questioned them individually, looked for inconsistencies in their stories that might reveal hidden knowledge. But the wall of ignorance held firm, reinforced by years of practice and the understanding that survival depended on maintaining unified silence in the face of white authority. "They know something," Robinson reported to Sheriff Walker as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the property. "Every one of them knows something, but getting them to talk would require methods that might damage valuable property. Your missing field hand is probably halfway to the Ohio River by now, assuming he had help from this underground railroad network everyone claims does not exist." The investigation expanded throughout the afternoon and into the evening. Deputies searched every building on the property, looking for evidence that might reveal what had happened to Alexander Davis and where Marcus Tharvin had gone. They found nothing useful. The gin house had been cleaned too thoroughly. The kitchen showed no signs that its tools had been used for anything beyond normal food preparation. The slave quarters revealed no hidden weapons or incriminating correspondence. As darkness fell over Cottonwood Estate, the authorities gathered in Davis's study to discuss their findings and plan their next actions. The conversation revealed deep disagreement about how to proceed. Some argued for aggressive interrogation of every enslaved person on the property, using whatever force was necessary to break their collective silence. Others counseled restraint, warning that excessive brutality might trigger the kind of widespread rebellion that plantation owners throughout the South feared more than any individual act of violence. By midnight, they had reached an uneasy consensus. A reward would be offered for Marcus's capture, large enough to tempt even those sympathetic to runaway slaves. Neighboring plantations would be warned about the incident, advised to increase security and vary the routines that made masters vulnerable to attack. The enslaved population at Cottonwood Estate would face increased surveillance but not collective punishment, at least not yet, to avoid creating martyrs or inspiring copycat violence. But beneath these practical decisions lay a deeper unease that none of the white men gathered in that study wanted to acknowledge directly. Marcus Tharvin had demonstrated that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence to plan elaborate revenge and the determination to execute it successfully. He had challenged the comfortable fiction that their property was too broken or too simple-minded to threaten the system that enslaved them. And if one Marcus could vanish after feeding his master to hogs, how many others might be capable of similar acts? How many were watching and learning from his example? How many were beginning to understand that masters were mortal? That authority built on violence could be challenged through violence, that some forms of justice existed outside any legal framework white society recognized or controlled. These questions would haunt Blackwood County and the wider South for years to come, transforming Marcus Tharvin from a missing field hand into something far more dangerous. A symbol of possibility, a legend whispered in slave quarters across Tennessee and beyond. The man who proved that even hogs have their standards about what they will consume, and that sometimes those standards are less discriminating than the society that claims to be civilized. The reward poster appeared in every county seat between Nashville and Memphis within 2 weeks of Alexander Davis's disappearance. $500 for information leading to the capture of Marcus Tharvin, described as a field hand of approximately 37 years, 5 feet 11 inches tall, bearing recent whipping scars across his back, and possibly traveling under assumed identity with forged freedom papers. The amount represented more money than most Tennessee families would see in 5 years, enough to tempt neighbors and strangers alike to scrutinize every unfamiliar face they encountered. Hosts. But Marcus Tharvin had vanished as completely as his former master, swallowed by networks that existed beneath the surface of ordinary society. 3 days after the discovery at Cottonwood Estate, a man calling himself Samuel Harris purchased supplies at a general store in Clarksville, paying with coins that bore the dull gleam of recently melted gold. He spoke with the careful diction of an educated freeman, carried papers identifying him as a carpenter from Kentucky, and attracted no particular attention beyond the routine suspicion that followed any person of color traveling alone through Tennessee. The store clerk would later remember the transaction only when questioned by authorities weeks after the fact, his description matching hundreds of other men who might or might not have been the fugitive everyone sought. By then, Samuel Harris had moved on, leaving behind only the memory of a polite customer and coins that could have come from anywhere. Freedom tastes like stolen gold, transformed into possibility. The Underground Railroad had been operating through Tennessee for nearly 2 decades. By 1852, a loose network of safe houses and river crossings known only to those who needed such knowledge. Conductors moved refugees north, using routes that changed constantly, adapting to increased patrols and shifting political landscapes. The system had been designed to transport people seeking freedom through escape, but it had evolved to serve other purposes as information about Marcus's actions spread through whispered conversations. From a coded letter intercepted near the Kentucky border in September 1852, the package from Blackwood County arrived safely, contents intact despite difficult journey. Cargo proves that certain agricultural procedures can be implemented successfully when circumstances require decisive action. We'll continue north as previously arranged. The letter's language seemed innocuous to casual readers, discussing agricultural matters in terms any farming community might use. But those familiar with Underground Railroad communications understood its true meaning. Marcus had been successfully evacuated from Tennessee, his identity transformed through the same careful process that had helped hundreds of others escape bondage. More significantly, his methods were being studied and potentially replicated by others who faced similar circumstances. Word of what happened at Cottonwood Estate spread through slave quarters across the South with remarkable speed, traveling through networks of communication that white authorities consistently underestimated or denied existed entirely. Field hands learned the story through songs that sounded like spirituals to unknowing ears, but carried detailed information about Marcus's planning and execution. Kitchen workers passed along details while preparing meals, their conversations masked by the clatter of pots and the crackle of cooking fires. Blacksmiths and carpenters shared knowledge while working, their discussions hidden beneath the sounds of hammers striking metal and saws cutting wood. The legend grew with each retelling, details embellished or altered to serve different purposes. Some versions emphasized Marcus's careful planning, teaching listeners about the importance of studying routines and identifying vulnerabilities. Others focused on the symbolic power of feeding a master to his own livestock, transforming an act of violence into a statement about the fundamental equality of all flesh when reduced to its basic components. The most popular versions described Marcus as having supernatural assistance, divine intervention helping him accomplish what seemed impossible through purely human means. By October, plantation owners throughout Tennessee and neighboring states had begun modifying their routines in response to the growing awareness of their vulnerability. Evening inspections were conducted in pairs rather than alone. Enslaved workers faced increased surveillance during night hours. Security measures that had seemed unnecessary in August became standard practice by autumn, physical manifestations of fear that no amount of official denial could fully suppress. Insurance companies took notice of the changing risk profile. Lloyd's of London, which had been insuring plantation owners against various losses for decades, issued a bulletin in November warning clients about increased incidents of property destruction and owner mortality in isolated rural locations. The document never explicitly mentioned enslaved people as potential threats, maintaining the fiction that such incidents resulted from external factors rather than internal resistance. But the premium increases that followed told a different story. Financial acknowledgement of dangers that polite society refused to name directly. What actually happened to Marcus after he left Tennessee remained deliberately obscure, protected by the same networks that facilitated his escape. Some reports placed him in Cincinnati by September, working as a carpenter under his new identity and living in a community of freed people who asked no questions about his past. Others suggested he had continued further north into Canada, settling in communities specifically established for escaped slaves beyond the reach of American fugitive laws. The most intriguing rumors claimed he had not stopped running at all, that he moved constantly between different locations, always staying ahead of slave catchers while serving as a consultant to others planning similar actions. According to these accounts, Marcus traveled under multiple identities, teaching the techniques he had developed through necessity to small groups who gathered in secret locations. Agricultural accident prevention, these sessions were supposedly called, a deliberately ironic name for gatherings that taught enslaved people how to create accidents that would eliminate their oppressors. Whether these stories reflected truth or wishful thinking remained impossible to verify. The Underground Railroad specialized in making people disappear completely, erasing their trails so thoroughly that even determined investigators found only dead ends and contradictory information. Marcus Tharvin had become a ghost, present everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, his actual location less important than the idea he represented. Back in Blackwood County, the investigation had effectively stalled by late September. Sheriff Walker had interviewed every enslaved person at Cottonwood Estate multiple times, employing various techniques ranging from gentle questioning to aggressive interrogation. The wall of collective ignorance held firm, reinforced by the understanding that breaking silence would bring consequences far worse than any punishment Walker might impose for refusing to cooperate. The hogs that had consumed Alexander Davis were slaughtered in early October, their meat deemed unsuitable for human consumption despite no rational basis for such judgment. Overseer William Brown arranged for the carcasses to be buried in a distant corner of the property, unable to articulate why the idea of eating animals that had fed on his former employer seemed unbearable. New breeding stock was purchased to replace them, but the replacement hogs displayed unusual behaviors from the moment they arrived, as if the pen itself carried some contamination that affected any creature housed within its boundaries. Local folklore began developing around Cottonwood Estate within weeks of the incident. Travelers claimed to hear strange sounds coming from the property at night, squealing, that seemed almost human in its desperation. Field hands working adjacent properties reported seeing lights moving through the cotton fields long after darkness fell, though no source for such illumination could be identified when investigated. The main house stood empty, William Brown having relocated to town rather than spend nights alone in a building that seemed to echo with absence and unspoken accusation. Other plantations in Tennessee experienced similar incidents through autumn and into winter, though the details were carefully suppressed to prevent widespread panic. A master in Davidson County was found dead in his tobacco barn in October, apparently crushed by falling equipment that had been improperly secured. The enslaved workers present at the scene provided consistent accounts of a tragic accident, their stories matching so perfectly that investigators suspected coordination but could prove nothing. An overseer in Rutherford County disappeared in November while inspecting livestock, his body discovered 3 days later at the bottom of a well, with injuries suggesting he had been struck before falling. The investigation concluded he had slipped on wet stones and died from the impact, though several deputies privately questioned whether any man could receive such specific head trauma from a simple fall. A prominent landowner in Williamson County died of apparent food poisoning in December, his symptoms consistent with arsenic exposure, though no source for such contamination could be identified in his kitchen or dining areas. His household staff expressed appropriate grief and shock, offering no information that might suggest deliberate poisoning despite intensive questioning. Each incident considered individually seemed explainable as accident or misfortune. But examined collectively, a pattern emerged that suggested coordinated action by networks operating beneath the surface of plantation society. The timing was too convenient. The circumstances were too similar. The enslaved population's collective ignorance was too consistent and too comprehensive to be entirely genuine. Federal authorities began taking notice by early 1853, recognizing that individual county sheriffs lacked the resources or jurisdiction to address what appeared to be an organized resistance movement. The Department of the Interior issued confidential guidance to territorial governors and federal marshals operating in slave states, advising increased vigilance regarding, quote, potential coordination between Northern abolitionist agitators and Southern property engaged in coordinated acts of industrial sabotage and violence against owners. The language was careful, avoiding any direct acknowledgement that enslaved people might possess the intelligence and organizational capacity to plan and execute such operations independently. The comfortable fiction had to be maintained that such incidents required outside instigation, that property left to itself would remain docile and manageable. To admit otherwise would be to acknowledge fundamental flaws in the ideological foundations that justified the entire plantation system. Congressional debates in early 1853 reflected growing concern about what some representatives carefully described as stability challenges in agricultural regions. Southern congressmen demanded increased federal resources for tracking fugitives and investigating suspicious deaths. Northern representatives questioned whether such incidents might reflect understandable responses to systematic brutality rather than unprovoked violence requiring suppression. The debates grew heated, as both sides recognized that they were arguing about more than specific criminal cases, that the real question concerned the sustainability of a system built on forced labor and maintained through violence. What drove the spread of these incidents across multiple states within months of Marcus's action at Cottonwood Estate? Was it truly coordinated resistance, some underground network teaching techniques and encouraging similar actions? Or was it something more organic, individuals independently reaching similar conclusions about their circumstances and available options? The authorities investigating these cases could never definitively answer such questions, confronted by walls of silence that no amount of interrogation could penetrate. The psychological impact extended far beyond individual plantations where incidents occurred. Masters throughout the South found themselves questioning the loyalty of enslaved people who had served them faithfully for years. Every neutral expression was scrutinized for hidden resentment. Every minor accident was examined for signs of sabotage. The comfortable assumption of absolute control had been shattered, replaced by nagging awareness that their authority rested on foundations more fragile than they had previously acknowledged. Some plantation owners responded by moderating their treatment of enslaved workers, calculating that improved conditions might reduce the likelihood of violent resistance. Whippings became less frequent or less severe. Food rations increased slightly. Some masters even experimented with small rewards for productive work, attempting to create incentives beyond the avoidance of punishment. Other owners moved in the opposite direction, implementing harsher discipline and more comprehensive surveillance in hopes of crushing any resistance before it could develop into action. These plantations saw increased use of physical punishment for minor infractions, mandatory reporting systems where enslaved people were required to inform on each other, and restrictions on movement that limited opportunities for communication and coordination. Both approaches acknowledged the same fundamental reality. The system had changed in ways that could not be reversed through denial or wishful thinking. Marcus Tharvin's actions at Cottonwood Estate had demonstrated possibilities that could not be erased from collective memory, seeds planted in minds across the South that would continue growing regardless of what authorities did to suppress them. In slave quarters throughout Tennessee and beyond, new songs emerged that celebrated agricultural accidents and mechanical failures, while maintaining the surface appearance of innocuous folk music. Children learned rhymes that sounded playful to white ears but carried coded information about vulnerability and opportunity. The oral tradition adapted to incorporate Marcus's story, transforming a specific incident into mythology that would outlast the individuals involved. The revolution Marcus had begun with cleaver and skinning knife was spreading through channels that authorities could neither fully map nor effectively control. It moved through whispered conversations and coded songs, through meaningful glances and careful silences. It lived in the minds of people who had learned that masters were mortal, that patience and planning could accomplish what strength and anger could not, that some forms of justice existed outside any framework white society recognized or approved. By the time winter settled over Tennessee in late 1853, the landscape had been permanently altered by events that began on a dark August night at Cottonwood Estate. The comfortable fictions that sustained the plantation system had been challenged in ways that even the most determined suppression could not fully reverse. And somewhere beyond the reach of slave catchers and federal marshals, a man who might have been Marcus Tharvin was living under a new identity, carrying knowledge that could never be taken from him regardless of what happened next. The hogs still squealed in the darkness of Tennessee nights, their cries carrying across cotton fields where people worked from dawn to dusk building wealth for those who claimed to own them. But the meaning of those squeals had changed for anyone who knew the story of what happened when one man decided that some lessons could only be taught through feeding masters to their own livestock, when victim became executioner, and the natural order was violently inverted in ways that would echo through generations. The courthouse records from Blackwood County were officially sealed in January 1867, locked away in basement storage where they would remain undisturbed for over a century. County Clerk Matthew Moore supervised the archiving personally, handling documents that detailed events too volatile for public consumption in the years immediately following the Civil War. The files contained not just the investigation into Alexander Davis's disappearance, but reports of 43 similar incidents across Tennessee between 1852 and 1861, each sharing characteristics that suggested coordination despite no definitive proof of organized networks. This is how uncomfortable truths disappear into official silence, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic procedure and deliberate forgetting. The case of Marcus Tharvin was declared closed in 1855, 3 years after his disappearance, when authorities concluded that further investigation would yield no useful results. The reward for his capture remained officially active until 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation made such bounties meaningless for enslaved people in Confederate territory. But closure on paper did not mean closure in reality. Sightings of Marcus continued to emerge from unlikely places for decades after he vanished from Cottonwood Estate. A skilled carpenter in Detroit, whose hands bore scars consistent with fieldwork, and whose knowledge of Tennessee geography seemed suspiciously detailed. A riverboat worker in St. Louis who displayed unusual expertise in livestock management despite claiming to have always worked on water. A mine supervisor in Colorado whose leadership style suggested someone who understood both sides of power dynamics in ways that required personal experience with bondage. Whether these reports represented the same individual or simply reflected men inspired by his legend remained impossible to verify. The Underground Railroad had perfected the art of creating new identities that could withstand scrutiny, transforming former slaves into free people through carefully constructed documentation and community support. Marcus Tharvin might have died crossing the Ohio River, or he might have lived to old age in Canada, or he might have remained in the South under a new name, continuing work that began on that August night in 1852. The ambiguity was deliberate, protection extending beyond any single person to encompass the possibility of resistance itself. As long as Marcus's fate remained unknown, the legend could grow without contradiction from reality. He became whatever the story required, martyr or survivor, teacher or ghost, depending on what message needed conveying in specific circumstances. Cottonwood Estate never recovered from the events of August 1852. William Brown attempted to maintain operations through the autumn, but productivity declined as the enslaved population engaged in subtle forms of resistance that stopped short of open rebellion. Tools disappeared. Equipment malfunctioned with suspicious frequency. Work proceeded at deliberately slowed pace that could not be proven intentional but resulted in significant losses. The property was sold at auction in spring 1853 to a speculator from Memphis who believed he could restore profitability through more efficient management. He lasted 8 months before abandoning the attempt, citing difficulties with the workforce that he could not overcome through any combination of incentives or punishments. The land changed hands 3 more times before the Civil War, each new owner discovering that some stains cannot be washed away through changes in management. By 1870, the main house stood empty and deteriorating, its windows broken and its floors rotting from years of neglect. Local residents avoided the property after dark, claiming to hear sounds that had no natural explanation. The hog pen where Alexander Davis had been consumed remained visible as a depression in the earth long after the wooden fences had collapsed, a scar on the landscape that refused to fade despite attempts to cultivate the area. The story of what happened at Cottonwood Estate was finally excavated from sealed archives in 1983 by a graduate student researching Tennessee agricultural history. Emily Johnson had been looking for information about cotton production yields when she discovered the investigation files, their contents contradicting every sanitized narrative she had been taught about antebellum plantation operations. Her dissertation, Resistance and Retribution, Violence in Tennessee Slave Society, 1850 to 1860, documented not just Marcus's actions, but the broader pattern of incidents that suggested organized resistance operating beneath the surface of official records. The academic community initially resisted her findings, uncomfortable with implications that challenged established historical narratives about enslaved people's capacity for strategic violence. But subsequent research by other scholars confirmed and expanded her work, revealing similar patterns in other Southern states, and forcing reconsideration of how resistance functioned within the plantation system. Modern Americans struggle with Marcus Garvin's legacy, uncertain whether to celebrate him as a freedom fighter who struck back against impossible oppression, or condemn him as a murderer who used extreme violence to achieve personal revenge. The moral calculus resists easy resolution, challenging comfortable categories that separate heroes from villains based on methods rather than circumstances. What remains undeniable is that Marcus's actions on that August night fundamentally altered the landscape of resistance in the antebellum South. He demonstrated that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence to plan elaborate revenge and the determination to execute it successfully. He planted seeds of possibility that grew in minds across multiple states, inspiring others to recognize that masters were mortal and that some forms of justice existed outside any legal framework. The courthouse basement in Blackwood County still contains boxes of documents related to the case, their pages yellowed and fragile, but their contents preserved for anyone willing to examine uncomfortable truths about American history. Researchers occasionally request access, seeking details about a man who vanished into legend and a system that could not acknowledge the intelligence and agency of people it claimed to own. And sometimes, on humid Tennessee nights when the air hangs heavy with the weight of history, people living near the ruins of Cottonwood Estate claim to hear hogs squealing with unusual intensity, as if the earth itself remembers what happened there and refuses to let the memory fade completely. The sounds carry across abandoned cotton fields toward a horizon that has witnessed tremendous change since 1852, yet still holds echoes of violence that shaped the nation in ways we continue grappling with generations later. Marcus Garvin fed his master to the hogs and vanished into freedom or death or something in between. His story survives in archives and oral tradition, in academic research and whispered legends. A reminder that systems built on violence inevitably produce violent responses, and that some lessons about human dignity and resistance can only be taught through actions that challenge every comfortable assumption about power and submission. The revolution he began with stolen blades and cold calculation continues in different forms, carried forward by those who recognize that true history requires confronting uncomfortable truths rather than accepting sanitized versions designed to protect established narratives. And whether Marcus lived to see freedom or died seeking it, his legacy endures in the knowledge that even the most oppressive systems contain vulnerabilities that determined people can exploit when circumstances make survival less important than justice, however brutal the form that justice takes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.